الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم
In the name of God the Almighty, good evening, everyone. We welcome you in day 2 of the third annual conference organized by the European Saudi Organization for Human Rights. Yesterday, we had a number of speakers, experts, researchers, also testimonies from the families of the victims. Today, we shall continue and viewing and listening to these experts, to these researchers on their testimonies, and also we will see altogether the video on whitewashing and the violations. I'm sorry, I can't hear him. It seems that there's a technical issue. Excuse me. So after viewing this video altogether, we shall begin with Professor Madawi Al-Rashid, who is a lecturer in London College for Economy and Political Sciences. She will speak about the whitewashing of Saudi in the academic halls of the university. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me today and also for your efforts in highlighting the human rights in Saudi Arabia to be always discussed in the international and national platforms. As we have all seen in the video, it appears that to what extent the Saudi regime is going all the way to change and whitewash the typical image about the country and the government, especially in the recent 7 years. As you all know, I will only speak about the academic halls and what is known as culture, especially the Western culture. Why in the Western regions? Because the Saudi regime, although it's trying to head towards Asia, as happened recently in the meeting with the Chinese president and also founding intimate relationships with India and Russia. However, there is a very important dilemma the Saudi regime suffers from, which is the security of the regime is connected closely to the Western states, headed by the United States of America and Europe, including France, Germany, and other countries, which guarantee the safety of the regime. I'm not saying the safety of the country, but the regime and the royal crown. This was actually clear in the recent 7 months with the increasing on the deterioration of the war between Russia and Ukraine, and how the European countries depend to a very big extent on the petroleum of Saudi Arabia. It appears that the West, which tried to create a certain space between the Saudi regime, especially the USA, has failed to a very big extent in doing that after it became subdued to the Saudi pressures through the energy resources. That's why the Saudi regime is trying to whitewash its reputation, especially in the West. It's within a strategy to protect the throne, because in the West, there was a lot of confusion, a lot of questioning on the seriousness of the relationship of Saudi Arabia and USA, especially after the assassination of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Turkey in 2018. So the Saudi government, headed by Mohammed bin Salman, were highly focusing in having two attempts to change or modify the cultural speech, because it's highly important. The cultural speech is a lot of governments actually depend on that, especially the governments in the West, because they are trying to read, to have opinions and perspectives on what is being issued from Saudi Arabia, all of that by academics, in order to follow up all the developments happening in the kingdom. And based upon that, they are trying to build up the future policies. So all from the beginning, there are three main axes for the prior phase, which actually happened far away, but continued also the reign of Mohammed bin Salman, first trying to impact the lobbies which are in USA and London and Washington, D.C., London, and other capitals around the world. So think tank or the research centers which actually address directly the decision makers in Washington and London and other cities. These centers address or use their speech by the business community, the businessmen, the petroleum companies, energy resources companies, all the companies which have really interests or investments in Saudi Arabia. They want to know to what extent this regime is solid and their investments are safe in that country. So among these centers, many of them are actually receiving support amounts of money directly by the Saudi regime, and based upon that, there is an attempt to produce a total new speech which would make the decision makers in the Europe or the Western governments, to make them feel comfortable that this regime is open and it's heading towards the liberalism, and to take down anything that may tackle the personal rights and would allow the community to express themselves in entertainment, tourism, the singing festivals, dancing in the streets. So these researchers in such centers are doing respective visits to the kingdom, and they are meeting and interviewing with persons who are related directly to the regime. They are telling them about the changes that are being done, and they would go back to their centers and writing reports saying that this community or this society, we should congratulate them for this very epic transfer change, because they have changed the old pattern related to extremism, to terrorism, to the Wahhabis call. All of this has been changed. They are trying to whitewash this from the historical memory of the West, that this community have actually made a whole turnover and became a total new community all through these reports, articles, and books being published. Of course, they are being published through being funding such centers, because one funding comes from some government. Of course, that this will affect or impact the academic speech or addressing. So the other thing is the university platforms. Since the petroleum issue happened, there is an access support funding to these universities, which are founding research centers. This will change from one country to another, from the USA to another country. In the USA and in the UK, they are allowing all the foreign funding to come to fund or support research centers in these universities. First of all, most of the universities are private universities. In the UK, the universities are neither private nor public. They are in between. These two, they are receiving funding and support from the local government, but they can also receive funding from offshore. And most of the European countries like Germany, France, Italy, most of these universities are public entities in which the funding usually is received from the state itself. That's why there's a confirmation from not receiving any foreign funding in such universities. However, there are some manipulative ways which Saudi Arabia can use to bring this funding to them, either through funding a research center. Let me tell you one example. In the university that I teach at, London School of Economics, we have a very big hall, Bin Zayed Hall, and it was funded by the United Arab Emirates. I remember in 2011 there were consecutive meetings and lectures in this hall speaking about democracy in the Arab world and the Arab Spring. This hall is under the name, this is probably a joke because about this name, because it's related to a place where they claim that we can speak about democracy totally freely. So funding just came in this way to give such posts in academic posts like Cambridge University in the UK. There is a special academic post, professor for Arab studies or Islamic studies. So all of these money have one goal. However, the universities would just confirm to their audiences and to their people, despite that they have foreign funding and foreign governments like Saudi Arabia, however, they are conserving the non-biased approach. However, there are attempts, but the real problem that the money is always related to attitudes, and this funding would actually stop if a contra attitude would happen, contra to what the donor wants. Also, there's another dilemma with the media, which is a part of the cultural aspect. As I recall in 2017, when Mohammed bin Salman was really highlighted in the media, journalists from around the world, especially from American newspapers like Washington Post, New York Times, and all the journalists, famous ones, they were very interested in following the Middle East, and they went to Saudi Arabia and wrote articles which may shock who follow them, because they would say that there's actually a revolution, there's a radical change, and Saudi Arabia would be a normal country without any violations. All of these writings and articles were or happened in the period when the regime tried to prove that it has changed to the better. This is a past period, but now we have the second phase, which is the social media period and the academic involvement who are related to the Saudi regime in whitewashing the regime image through using the social media or through using the tweets, especially. For example, as in the tourism sector, we have the influencers, or what they call are known as influencers. They are brought up to taking photos in some very important touristic sites in the country. And most of them are women from Australia, from European countries, and they would pay them big amounts of money just as a touristic visit, with taking photos of them in very special regions for the tourism aims. The same attitude is being used by the academics who are in Saudi Arabia. So as monitoring Twitter and other social media platforms, I find that some academics, they have been really away from the academic researchers. They were just wandering around the country and taking photos. I will not mention any names, but this is very clear. In an attempt to whitewash the country and the regime and the so-claimed change. And all of this would tackle the sensations or the emotions of the investors or the decision makers in the West who want they want them to believe that the country has actually changed and there is a better future under the reign of this regime. And all of these attempts are attempt to change the reputation, the image, especially since 2018. The event which happened in 2018 was disastrous as for Saudi Arabia and its reputation worldwide. That's why there was a very frank desire to use the public relation companies as well as exploring the academic spaces, which are usually outside the PR or the image reputation improvements. However, the regime wants to go slowly and softly to mingle in the Western civil community because they are well aware that the public opinion in the West has changed and has been against the kingdom, especially in the last 7 to 8 years. There are many events which have turned the opinion of the West against Saudi Arabia, especially the imprisonment of the women, which was very important for the global civil society, especially before the UN agencies, the human rights organizations, and the Western parliaments. All of this focus has actually affected the reputation of Saudi Arabia. There was a very frank desire to affect the new generation students who actually receive their education through professors who have direct relationships with Saudi Arabia, either through their writings, their articles, their teaching, to change the public opinion worldwide. I believe that this attempt is going on until today. And I don't know to what extent it has been successful because we can't really monitor or document this, and to what extent it can impact the decisions of the governments, the businessmen. Are they actually being hesitant or going to the to visit the country just because they read some article which is actually complementing, as happened in the last six past years, especially the businessmen in which they are actually having increasing amounts of investments to Saudi Arabia. In 2018, a lot of known persons and banks and commercial centers and commercial posts, they have never been to Saudi Arabia at the last moment. So we shouldn't lose hope here. the efforts that you are doing as a human rights organization and other similar organizations do impact in having an equilibrium in the public opinion, so it won't be totally subdued to the Saudi whitewashing, either through think tanks or the Saudi lobby in the Western capitals or the universities or the media channels or even the academic influencers who are exploiting their posts as academics to publish such a humanitarian image about the country. Their first concern is to make the Saudi regime to be humane. Like other normal countries, there are touristic sites, people living just in normal life, but without highlighting any kind of suffering of the prisoners or detainees, executions which are going on in the country, because this would be a black point in the series of the narrations, the new narrations, which the regime is trying to prove. Thank you so much, Doctor, for your intervention. We would like to hear more of you, but due to the lack of time, now we shall be with other interventions. If anyone has any comment or question. So there's one question, Doctor. So it's a mixed question about the academic reality for Saudis outside and your personal experience. We don't see a lot of immigrants going from Saudis who are in the Western capital. Some of them would actually cheer to the Saudi regime. How do you consider this limitation in the academics and their limited numbers?
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the question. I think, so could you just repeat it? I didn't hear the first part.
نعم سؤال فيه مزيج بين السؤال
this question, it's a mix about asking the academic reality of Saudis offshore and about your personal experience. We don't see a lot of people immigrating from Saudis from the outside. Some of them actually cheer the Saudi regime. How do you consider this? As I understood, why there are people who are outside. Is this the question? This is also what I understood, that the academics are actually cheering the Saudi regime instead of speaking the voice of the people. So the academics, the Western academics, or do you mean the Saudi academics? The Saudi academics. We don't have a lot of academics. There are very few numbers in the Western universities. However, the problem here is even if we have academics and even if we have a lot of students who follow up their PhD studies or have academic research, we must understand that it would be difficult here, the detaining which happened and also dismissing some students after 2011. This is because they have shared some tweets or encouraged the democratic movements in the Arab world. They were called for the consulates and they were dismissed from the missions, and they couldn't continue their studies. This happened to a lot of Arab students, especially in the Gulf, the students from Bahrain, from Saudi Arabia, A lot were in USA, Canada, and UK, and they weren't able to pay the fees of tuitions for their universities or to even afford this. So we must understand the situation of such academics who or those who do academic research. As for the West, the problem is the academic who wants to study the situation of Saudi Arabia. He must be very sure that he would be able to enter the country. This is related to the visa. If he wrote a report after visiting Saudi Arabia in a way that the regime doesn't like, probably he won't be able to visit the country again, and therefore he won't have any relationship in any way to the country. A lot of academics who wrote articles about sensitive issues in the last 10 years are banned from entering Saudi Arabia again. And therefore, they won't be able to develop their academic capabilities or getting any promotions, because a lot of researches depend on having the researcher inside the country. As of my personal experience, when I write books or articles or researches, a lot of researches which I did depends on the historical archive, which aren't controlled by the Saudi regime. And I can go to the archive and follow what's written in it. And in my specialization, there was a period where I was able to communicate with some people through Skype, and Zoom wasn't there before, or through telephone to interview them. So I recall that, but this is an opportunity for me because I live outside, and because my political attitudes are well known, or approaches are well known, but I am banned from entering Saudi Arabia. But any person who communicates with me from the inside would be highlighted in a way. A group of persons from HASM, which is a human rights association, the public prosecutor, one of their accusations against them is that they communicated with me, or their books were uploaded at their laptops. So this is also a part of the charges against them. So in my last book, which is the Son of the King, I try to protect the persons in the inside and not communicate with them. So the subject, main subject, is the Saudis and the immigrant outside Saudi Arabia, in Berlin and Canada and USA and UK. I communicated with them, and I wrote the book based upon the information they actually gave me. So if you were a Western academic and you wish to go to Saudi Arabia, so you can choose people who may be at risk because they have expressed their opinion, which the regime doesn't like. Thank you, Doctor. Now we shall view together a video about Khamis Mushet.
No country in the world would accept that its educational system be invaded by any radical group. We're working on an initiative which we will launch in the near future to introduce regulations ensuring equal pay for men and women.
But you're talking about equal pay. Women can't even drive in this country. This is the last place in the world that women don't have the rights to drive.
This is no longer an issue. Today, driving schools have been established and will open soon. In a few months, women will drive in Saudi Arabia. We are finally over that painful period that we cannot justify. Today, Saudi women still have not received their full rights. There are rights stipulated in Islam that they still don't have. We have come a very long way and have a short way to go.
ما نسمعك.
We can't hear you. Excuse me. So the Tunisian nurse Mahdia Al-Marzouki was sentenced to prison 15 years in Saudi Arabia because of retweeting her brother Nidal Al-Marzouki will speak about the suffering of his sister and the family. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for giving me the chance, and I cannot open the camera because I'm in the car. There is no problem. Stay safe, and we are pleased to have you among us. So the problem happened with my sister in 2020 when Saudi authorities and the Health Saudi organization during the COVID in 2020, in July 2020, we were informed, or we knew by her friends, that my sister was imprisoned and arrested. We didn't know the cause of arrest because the consulate didn't give us any clear information. After a lot of communication, we knew that the reason of detaining is using Twitter and Facebook. So my sister has done some tweets, some publications, which the Saudi regime disliked. And that's why they decided to imprison him. She was arrested for a whole year, and after that, the trial started. First judgment was issued after 1 year and a half, and it was a very brutal judgment for 7 years and a half, and also with a pending execution for 1 year. So for 2.5, we tried to oppose and to appeal this judgment in order to decrease the years. However, they increased the years of sentence, and the same charge was issued against her, and they actually threatened her by a weapon. And the charge is also because she did a tweet. She retweeted, and she was charged for terrorism and also destabilizing the security of the country. So just look about the charge they have accused her, and this is totally illogic. There is no relational link to each other. There is no actual link between these two things. And I apologize for using English sometimes. There is no problem. So, Mr. Nidal, I would like to ask you if you want to add any other thing, or shall we pose any questions? Whatever. If you have any questions, I wanted to talk really briefly. It's very important to us to hear what you have to say, and I wanted to comment, and we would leave this opportunity for anyone who wants to pose any question. So as for the appeal for the judgments, unfortunately, there are a lot of cases when the concerned persons would appeal the judgments, then the judgment would multiply in the sentence or in the years. Unfortunately, your sister is not the only one. A lot of similar cases, and this actually signifies the problem of the judicial system in Saudi Arabia, because the Saudi regime and the judicial system there is not independent and is actually driven by politics and also full of defaults. I would like to know what are the circumstances of your sister there. Frankly speaking, The social advisor from the consulate visited her, and he confirmed that she has good conditions, no impacts of any torture. Thanks God. We were confirmed by the social advisor. He visited her last Tuesday. At least when he visited her, he didn't find any traces of torture. This is a good news compared to other cases who their families have no idea about them. We have heard about one of the cases yesterday. So we really hope that she would be set free, hopefully. Would anyone like to pose a question for Nidal? I have a comment here. I heard the story, and actually, frankly, it's very sad. I would imagine if she was a nurse from another country, like a nurse from the UK or from France, then what would be her fate? Would she face the same fate? So it's not a question we can actually answer, but it's just a question which we are posing because there are precedents where governments of such cases, if we had a similar case, the government would follow up her citizens. It would know what are their problems. If they were imprisoned, they would demand just trials. Did the Tunisian government actually demand that and focused on her case? Thank you for your question. At the first, since 1.5 years, and when this was public to the media, the Tunisian government didn't intervene at all, with no minimal efforts. However, after some efforts for human rights in Tunisia and other NGOs, we raised the voice all the way to the Tunisian government and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and now they are trying to do some communication, but actually the thanks are sent to the human rights NGOs because they raised our voice and it reached to the Tunisian authorities, or else they wouldn't have discussed her case. We would like to thank you for your concern and concern for your sister, and this is a duty. Some would feel fearful or would have other excuses. We really hope that she would be set free. And we thank you, Nidal, for participating with us today. Thank you. Now we will be with Maysam Atamar, who is a Pakistani national and a prior imprisoned in the Saudi prisons, and he will tell us the story of his friend Saudi Al-Farj, who is detained at the Saudi prisons. Maitham, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum and hi.
Wa alaikum assalam.
My name is Maitham. I am a Pakistani citizen arrested in Saudi Arabia without legal justification. I lost my job and career, did not receive compensation, and suffered from anxious fear. My family did not know where I was, and to this day I am still suffering as a result of what I went through. The suffering that I lived through for a month ended with my return to my homeland, Pakistan. It is true that I'm still suffering from the effects what I went through, but it know that I left behind those who may have shared my suffering and are still suffering to this day. I am here today to talk about the case of one of my cellmates, not myself, the case of Saud Al-Faraj, who faces the risk of being sentenced to death. I have been detained in a solitary cell since October 2020. After we got out the solitary cell, they put us in a group room where we moved from one room to another. Saud was with me most of the time. I closely touched what Saud was subjected to from the first moment. He was placed in a cell with detainees of foreign nationalities in an attempt to isolate him and limit his communication with others. Before being placed with us in the cell, Saud had been subjected to extensive violations. During the interrogation period, as he remained in the solitary cell for 19 months, and he was brutally tortured through beating, electric shocks, suspension, and other after his transfer to the mass prison. The violation continued against him, which promoted him to file complaints. Among that is a complaint to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Saud spoke in the complaint about everything he was subjected to, including the threat of arrest and rape of his wife, tortured and forcing him to sign confessions and depriving him of communication with the outside world for many months. After filing the complaints, the officer treated him with vengeance and asked him why he had filed it more than once. They also confiscated pens and papers in prison to prevent him from writing further complaints. Saud continued to demand his legitimate rights, especially since he was familiar with the law. He was demanding his rights to communicate with his family and to meet with them, in addition to his right to medical treatment after being prevented for a long time from contacting his family. Saud raised his voice again to demand his rights. A number of security men entered the cells, handcuffed him, and forcibly removed him from the cell. We didn't know where they took him. After about an hour, they brought him back, showing signs of severe beating. Saud was bleeding from the torture, though he was not referred to a doctor. With this demand still ignored, Saud declared a hunger strike, where he remained on strike for seven days before being transferred to the hospital due to his health condition. Saud stopped his hunger strike after promises to change their dealing with him. But these promises were not implemented until I got out of prison and said goodbye to him. The violation and ill treatment continue against Saud. His trial is still going on, while the public prosecution officer is calling for his death. I'm living today with the impact of what I went through, and I'm still suffering from its effects. And my family is still afraid that I should stay away from them. My psychological and material suffering did not end, but the suffering for dozens and have left them double behind me. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, so I'm here.
أود أن أشكرك في البداية قبل
I would like to thank you before posing any question for your courage. And I really hope that Saud would be set free, and also that you would end your suffering and everything that you have went through. If anyone has any question to Maytham, then the platform is yours. Thank you, Maysam. I would like only to thank Maysam, and I would like also to ask him the torture which he has been through before putting him in another cell with other people. Did the signs of torture were very clear? Did he notice how his health condition was in his first meeting with Saud? Can you, Maytham, share with us this if he likes, of course?
Yeah, Saud actually, when he was transferred to Jamai, so his health condition was very bad. Like he was suffering from backbone pain, and also he was suffering some other diseases like stomach diseases. So he requested many times just to consult a doctor. But those all management were coming and they were just replying that you are not in hotel, you are in prison. So tolerate these all pains. So we like that you just face this condition and to tolerate those all pain.
Thank you, Maytham. I would like to have as a comment. Any person who testifies such violations, this torture, and documents this is considered a human rights defender and the voice for the victims. Thank you so much, Maytham, and Nidal also.
You are welcome.
وننتقل إلى
Now we shall see together a video
العائلة الباكستانية
about the Pakistani family.
अस्सलामुअलैकुम, मेरा नाम ताहिरा जोजा मोहम्मद शबीर। हमें 2016 में एक औरत थी जिन्होंने हमें कहा कि हम आपको फ्री उम्रा करवाते हैं। उन्होंने ना हमें उम्रे का झांसा दिया और हमसे कहा कि आपको हम लोग ना हमारा एक इदारा है जो फ्री उम्रे करवाता है। तो इस तरह ना उन्होंने हमें ना मेरे बच्चों को भी, मुझे भी, मेरे शोहर को भी, हम लोगों को उन्होंने उम्रे के लालच में ना बुलाया कि आए जी हम आपके पासपोर्ट बनाते हैं और सब कुछ करते हैं, हमारा इदारा जो है वो फ्री उम्रे करवाता है। और हम लोगों ने ये उम्रे के लालच में उनकी बातों में आके तो हम लोगों ने उनके साथ हम लोग गए हैं। जैसे हम उनके साथ गए हैं, उन लोगों ने पहले तो उन्होंने हमारे पासपोर्ट वगैरह बनाए हैं। वो हमें यानी कि हमें यकीन दिलाया है कि भी वो वाकई कोई इदारा है। उन्होंने अपने पास से हमारे पासपोर्ट बनाए हैं और बना के फिर उन्होंने कहा जी ये हम वीज़े लगवा के आपको इंशाल्लाह उम्रे पे भेजेंगे, मेरे बच्चों का, मेरा, मेरे खामद का। फिर हम लोगों को वो लोग लेके गए हैं कि जी चले जी आपके अंगूठे लगने हैं, आज उनके ये हो गया, आपके वीज़े हो गए, इंशाल्लाह आपकी टिकट 1-2-3 दिन में आपकी उम्रे की टिकट है। हम लोग अपने घर में बहुत खुश थे कि हम बैतुल्लाह की ज़ियारत करने के लिए जा रहे हैं। बहुत खुशी से हम लोग घर से गए हैं सबसे मिलके। जब हम गए हैं तो आगे उन्होंने हमें रिसीव किया है। रिसीव करके भी अभी आपके कुछ कागज़ रहते हैं जिन पे अंगूठे लगने हैं। और जैसे उन्होंने हमें रिसीव कर लिया है, वो हमें यानी कि बस हम लोगों को अकेलों को लेके गए हैं, आज साथ किसी फैमिली को उन्होंने आने नहीं दिया और हमें पेशावर ले गए हैं। पेशावर वो लोग हमें ले गए हैं जहाँ हमें कुछ पता नहीं था कि ये कौन सा इलाका है। बस वहाँ जब हमने देखा है कि सब पठान है और एक वो जो औरत थी उसका खामद था साथ, तो उन्होंने हमें वहाँ पे रखा है। 2 दिन तक उन्होंने हमें वहाँ पे रखा है। फिर उसके बाद उन्होंने हमसे ये मंशियात वगैरह जो है उन्होंने बोला ये सामान आपने लेके जाना है और अगर आप ये नहीं लेके जाते हैं तो हम आपको यहाँ पे, यानी मेरे बच्चों को भी कह ले के उन्होंने धमकियाँ दी हैं। मेरे बच्चों को भी अर्गमाल बना लिया और हमें भी इस चीज़ की धमकियाँ दी हैं और हम लोग बहुत डर चुके थे उस वक़्त। फिर उन्होंने जो बोला वो हमें करना पड़ा और हम लोगों को एयरपोर्ट छोड़ के आए। हम घर से 2-3 दिन पहले वो हमें ले गए थे कि हम लोग उम्रे पे जा चुके हैं और उन्होंने हमारे घर वालों को भी कोई इत्तला नहीं दी। हमें इधर से पाकिस्तानी एयरपोर्ट से किसी ने ना पकड़ा है, ना वो पाकिस्तान एयरपोर्ट के अंदर वो लोग मौजूद थे। उन्होंने हम पे नज़र रखे हुए थे कि आप किसी से ना बात कर सकते हैं और ना किसी से मिल सकते हैं। यानी कि यहाँ पे भी लोग कुछ ऐसे थे कि जो लोग उनको जानते थे और जो हमें फॉलो कर रहे थे कि आप लोग जाओ आगे। और बहुत से लोग देखे कि पाकिस्तान एयरपोर्ट से हम जब गुजरे हैं तो किसी ने हमें कुछ नहीं कहा, ना कुछ देखा, ना कुछ। लेकिन जब हम सऊदी एयरपोर्ट पे पहुंचे हैं, जैसा ही हम जद्दा एयरपोर्ट पे उतरे हैं, उन्होंने हमें पकड़ लिया है और बच्चों को अलहदा और मुझे अलहदा और मेरे खामद को अलहदा कर दिया। और कितने साल, 7 साल हो गए मेरे शोहर को उधर, 5 साल तक मैं उधर रही हूँ, 3 साल तक मेरे बच्चे उधर रहे हैं और अलहदा मुझसे रहे हैं। और उसके बाद उन्होंने मेरे बच्चों को, वो भी फिर मैंने अपने सफारत खाने से रुजू किया तो मेरे सफारत खाने वालों ने मेरे बच्चों को भेज दिया। लेकिन मेरे शोहर का आज कुछ दिनों से कुछ भी पता नहीं है। जैसे ही हमें हुक्म हुआ, उन्होंने उनको हुक्म कसास का दिया और हमें 15-15 साल का हुक्म दिया। हम लोग, मुझे 5 साल के बाद उन्होंने 5 साल में भेज दिया है उन्होंने, और यही था कि वो भी आ जाएंगे। हम इसी उम्मीद पे थे कि यही आ जाएंगे। हमने उन्हें बताया है कि आप हमारा रिकॉर्ड चेक करें, पाकिस्तान से चेक करें, हम कोई क्रिमिनल लोग नहीं हैं, हम बस उम्रे के लालच में इधर आ गए हैं। आप जाके उधर हमारा रिकॉर्ड चेक करें कि कभी हमसे कोई ऐसी गलती नहीं हुई या हमारा कोई किसी जुर्म या थाने या किसी चीज़ में कोई, एक गरीब घराने से हूँ मैं, ऐसा हमारा कोई भी ऐसा कारोबार नहीं है जिसमें हमें कोई ऐसे लोगों से हमारा वास्ता नहीं है। तो फिर उसके बाद उनको हमने बहुत हमने उनके आगे अपील की है, लेकिन उन्होंने कुछ नहीं सुना हमारा। उन्होंने मुझे ये सज़ा दी है, 5 साल के बाद मुझे भेज दिया है। मेरे खामद का ये कसास का हुक्म जो उन्होंने दिया हुआ था वही रखा है, हमें उन्होंने कुछ नहीं बताया। और वो रोज़ हमें वहाँ से रब्ता करते थे, रोज़ हमसे वो बात करते थे कि उधर उन्होंने वो फ़ोन लगाए हैं जहाँ से वो हमसे रब्ता करते थे। हम उन्हें नहीं कर सकते, लेकिन वो हमसे रब्ता करते थे। उसके बाद कुछ दिन पहले मुझे फ़ोन आया है एक उधर से कि आपके शोहर को यहाँ से ले गए हैं। मेरे शोहर ने नहीं किया, वहाँ से किसी ने फ़ोन किया है, अल्लाह जाने वो कौन है कौन नहीं। उन्होंने फ़ोन किया है कि आपके शोहर को यहाँ से ले गए हैं, आप उनकी मग़फ़िरत के लिए दुआ कीजिए। और मुझे उस दिन से ना तो मेरे शोहर का फ़ोन आया है और ना ही उनकी कोई खबर है। और मेरे बच्चे, छोटे छोटे मेरे बच्चे हैं, मेरा खामद के अलावा मेरा कौन है, और मुझे उनका अभी तक कुछ पता नहीं चल रहा। और मुझे ये भी पता नहीं है कि मैं कहाँ जाके अपील करूं जहां मेरी सुनवाई हो, जो मुझे इतना बता दे कि मेरे बच्चों का बाप किधर है, उन्हें कौन ले गया, कहाँ ले गया, और जो जिसकी हमें इत्तला भी नहीं दी, चाहे उनके साथ कुछ भी है वो हमें इत्तला तो करें। हमें कुछ पता नहीं है और मुझे कुछ पता नहीं चल रहा कि मैं कहाँ जाऊं और कहाँ जाके अपील करूं। मुझे आप लोगों से सबसे मेरी गुजारिश है कि मेरी मदद की जाए, मेरे शोहर का पता लगा दिया जाए, मुझे पता लगा के बताया जाए, मुझे रास्ता दिखाया जाए। मुझे कुछ पता नहीं है कि मैं कहाँ से कहाँ जाऊं और कहाँ अपील करूं और कहाँ से मैं अपने बच्चों के बाप का पता लगाऊं।
كانت هذه
This
شهادة
was one of the testimonies of a Pakistani family of a detainee in Saudi Arabia, which she doesn't know any information about. Now we shall be with
قصة نجاح
USA, a
التعاون
success story of a lobby group to stop the cooperation between New Haven and the Fahad Security College after the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi with the journalist and author Stanley Hiller. Stanley, you have the platform.
Hello. Hello, everyone. I'll be giving a talk about a campaign in Connecticut, USA, that a committee I head, the Middle East Crisis Committee, waged against a university that had ties to a Saudi police and military institution. I hope it will spur some of you to create campaigns on local institutions connected to Saudi tyranny. I'm a retired school teacher and I believe very much in the visual, so I'll illustrate this talk with PowerPoint slides. just have to find them. Right in front. Our Middle East Crisis Committee formed in Connecticut in 1982 to support Palestinians during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon that year. We've gotten involved in a number of human rights struggles, but have come fairly late to the issues in Saudi Arabia. These are screenshots from our website. In 2016, we picketed Yale Law School twice because it had accepted $10 million from a Saudi billionaire connected to the Saudi government. And we were incensed over the lack of a real justice system within the kingdom and over its war against Yemen. Our group and some others created a website calling for the US to end its alliance with the Saudi regime. And this is the current homepage of that site. In 2017, we learned that a Connecticut university called the University of New Haven was forming a partnership with the Saudi King Fahd Security College, a college that trains all Saudi police and also takes part in military training. The specific college involved was the Institute of Forensic Science of the University of New Haven, UNH. Forensics is the use of science to solve crimes. The institute was named for a forensic scientist, Henry C. Lee, who you see pictured here. He had become famous for testifying in several famous trials. Henry C. Lee was head of this UNH Institute. We wrote a letter of complaint to UNH, but received no answer. So we organized an open letter signed by around 40 US activists, writers, and academics, asking the college to end its agreement with the King Fahd Security College. I should point out that UNH is a private school, so its finances are not transparent to the public, and they can keep people off the campus if they like. We called in this open letter, we called out collaboration with the kingdom that did not respect human rights and that was engaged in a pitiless war against Yemenis. We received no answer from the college, but the student newspaper, the Charger Bulletin, reported on the letter on its front page. I had an article in the liberal magazine, The Nation, in the spring of 2018, but then things dried up. On October 2nd, 2018, Saudi citizen and Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi disappeared after going to a Saudi consulate in Turkey. Friends hoped he had merely been detained, but it soon came out that he had been murdered and his body had been cut up and disappeared. The man who was said to have used the bone saw knife was this man, Salah al-Tubaigi, who we learned was a forensic expert. Here are two pictures of Tubaigi. The word forensic had popped up again, so we looked to see if there was any connection between Henry C. Lee and Salah al-Tubaigi. It didn't take long to find out. Al-Tubeigi was on the board of the Saudi Society for Forensic Medicine. Henry C. Lee was on the editorial board of the Journal of the Saudi Society for Forensic Medicine, and so was Salah Al-Tubeigi. The red arrows point to both names on these screenshots from October 2018. We issued a press release and there was tremendous interest. Here's an article in the Hartford Courant, the most important Connecticut newspaper. Their reporter was actually able to speak to Henry C. Lee. He said he didn't remember Al-Tubeigi, but that he might have bumped into him at some meeting. This is coverage in the New Haven Register and in the national magazine Newsweek. The radio show Counterpoint. The student newspaper at the university once again. The top leftist show in the US, Democracy Now! Al Jazeera. Connecticut, oh, here's another one from Inside Higher Education. This talks about Blumenthal. He's a senator, one of the two senators from Connecticut. Connecticut Senator Richard Blumenthal raised his concerns publicly about this matter, something he had never done before on Saudi Arabia. Despite the name University of New Haven, it's located in a smaller city next to New Haven called West Haven. In January of 2019, we went to the West Haven City Council. A number of us held up signs while several spoke and asked the council to talk to UNH about its Saudi ties. As it turned out, the head of the council was the head of police at UNH. Nothing was done. In an op-ed in the spring of that year in the New Haven paper, we called on Henry C. Lee to resign from the Saudi Forensic Magazine Board and that UNH take some other measure to break with the King Fahd College. However, neither Lee nor UNH reacted publicly, not even when Al-Tubeigi was convicted of murder later that year by a Saudi court. In May of 2020, we wrote to UNH again. Their contract with the King Fahd Security College was going to expire in June of 2021. We asked them not to renew it. We never heard from the college, but it appears they did not renew. A reporter from a Washington think tank contacted me and said he was doing a study about the UNH and the Saudis. I gave him all the information I had and he did his own investigation. He was able to contact a faculty member who had been in Saudi Arabia doing work for UNH. And that man told him he was back in the States and that the program was over. Indeed, we were not able to find any information connecting the King Fahd Security College with UNH again. Now, I admit this is not ironclad proof, but crossing our fingers, we are thinking that UNH didn't want to be seen as bowing to pressure, but did quietly end its relationship with the Saudi regime. So we think we have a success here, and we hope this may give you some ideas on tactics for similar campaigns. I have two more slides, and I'm going to put some information in the chat. Let me start with the chat. So that's information about contacting me, some of the websites that I've talked about. I'll also put in some other ideas. I don't have time to talk about them, but I'll put in 3 sections of, I have to put it to everybody. I have to change that. I hope you're all able to see this, but it's ideas on issues that you could bring up, that you could connect locally. For instance, the colleges. The Saudis have given tons of money to colleges all across the United States, and I'm sure other countries. And you could find out about that and raise that. Why are they doing this? And what are they getting out of it? And whether this should be stopped. Other things like Lou Jane and the fact she's freed, but is not allowed to leave Saudi Arabia or even talk freely about her imprisonment. And lastly, I'll put in those links again. I wasn't sure I was sending it to everybody a little while ago. Okay, there. So I am done, and I'd be interested in your questions.
شكرا ستانلي.
Thank you, Stanley, for your presentation and these valuable information. So if anyone has any question for Stanley, you have the platform. I would like to thank Mr. Stanley for his intervention, especially as for Saudi Arabia. It's very important and encouraging to hear success stories, success efforts, because it doesn't happen a lot. So thank you so much for this.
Certainly.
لدي سؤال لك.
So I have a question to you, Mr. Stanley. So you did all of these noble efforts. How did you find the counter efforts led by Saudi Arabia and the USA through its funding and money? To what extent they are actually successful? What are the claims they base them upon? And to what extent, what are your future plans for your work in the future?
Well, I'm not exactly sure on the question, but in terms of future plans to continue on these human rights issues, we have a TV show, The Struggle Video, and we'll use a lot of the video that was done today and yesterday, that terrible story about the Pakistani family who was fooled into bringing drugs to Saudi Arabia. The ESOHR campaign about stopping executions of people for drug offenses, and so many of the other things. The mistreatment of Shia Muslims, the complete lack of religious freedom, the lack of unions to organize in Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's so many things that we can talk about, and bring up in the United States, women's issues, which are very big in the United States. So there's a lot that we can do, and we hope to hear from other people with their issues, and we hope to assist them.
شكرا.
Thank you
شكراً.
so much.
ونعرض فيديو عن
Now we shall see a video about Hussein Abu al-Khair. It would be in Arabic language at first, then we would see another video in the same topic, but in the English language.
خالي معتقل بالسعودية بتهمة تهريب المخدرات وخالي مظلوم.
يعني أنا لما حكى معي أخوي من يوم الجمعة لهلا أنا دمعتي ما جفت ليل ولا نهار، وأنا نازلة بقول لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله، بس أملي بالله وأمل عندي أنا ما بنقطع، وإن شاء الله أخوي يرجع لي.
خالي معتقل بالسعودية بتهمة تهريب المخدرات وخالي مظلوم.
يعني أنا لما حكى معي أخوي من يوم الجمعة لهلا أنا دمعتي ما جفت ليل ولا نهار، وأنا نازلة بقول لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله، بس أملي بالله وأمل عندي أنا ما بنقطع، وإن شاء الله أخوي يرجع لي.
وننتقل إلى استماع إلى شهادة من عائلة أحد
So now
الضحايا.
we shall be with a testimony from one of the family of the victims who are at risk of execution by Mr. Ali Ashtar. Good evening, everyone. I send you my greetings. In the name of God the Almighty, greetings everyone, and good evening to everyone. I thank you for giving me this opportunity today. I would like to thank also your organization for these noble efforts in defending human rights in my country and also human rights for the persons who are living in my country. I truly thank you. I'm sending you this letter today, and I can't share you neither my photo, my voice, or my name, because I fear that my family would be revenged. But I will try to tell you a part of what we're suffering, we who were born in the Saudi kingdom. I'm going to tell you about the story of my brother who is at risk of execution for charges related to my younger brother, who was one of the activists who participated in the protests where they expressed their opinions. My brother was arrested after these protests in Al-Qatif. The arrest of my brother to force his other brother to turn himself in with hundreds of others, and since his detain, his suffering started, including torture, mistreatment in the prison, and deprivation of the right to defend himself and to communicate with the family and with the outside world. My brother remains in the solitary confinement for months. He was sick and he was deprived from seeing a doctor. And he was forced to sign confessions. He was sentenced to execution, and right now he is among the lists of people threatened to executed. My brother, along with other hundreds of men, their lives have ended since the moment they were arrested. Along with their detain, the suffering started with their families and their communities. Fear goes along my family each moment because they fear for the life of their son and the life of their other children who are outside the prison. They are living in confusion because defending my brother is considered a crime which the other members of the family would be punished for. And also speaking about the execution risk for my brother is also considered a crime as for the Saudi government. Speaking about the violations which my brother was subjected to is also considered a crime. And also speaking about what my family is suffering since he was detained is considered a crime. So Saudi Arabia isn't just violating the rights of the prisoner only, and not only issuing arbitrary judgments or sentences, but it's using these sentences to terrorize us as families, to spread fear in the community and isolate the detainees and deprive them of any right in defending themselves and narrating their stories. The Saudi government have dealt with the community members in a whole as being criminals. They've charged them with accusations just because they have expressed their opinions and demanded legitimate rights. Some of others who are demanding legitimate rights. Today, I cannot show my photo or you cannot hear my voice because I fear that my family would be revenged. And they have threatened my family tens of times because they asked them to not communicate with any human rights organization. They had threatened my family from not communicating with any human rights organization, and tens of others have a similar situation like mine. And although I am certain that silence doesn't mean that the life of my brother isn't at risk, but because I fear of more revenge is preventing me from speaking publicly. As happened before, the Saudi authorities have executed 81 men in 12 March 2022, which is a massive group execution in the kingdom since years, despite its late promises. However, the kingdom since years is still promising to do more execution for their activists and their families. Just imagine the number of the people detained, and because they don't have the chance to raise their voices due to these threats. So imagine the many number of detainees who don't have the chance to raise their voices due to these threats. Saudi Arabia is threatening the life of youth by execution and depriving them from their liberty, and is trying to prevent any speech or voice about them, and it's trying to silence a whole society. And outside Saudi Arabia, Saudi regime is paying the money to whitewash its image and its reputation, was far away from the reality of what we are living inside. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much, Ali, for delivering the voice who cannot speak himself in a direct way or either showing his photo. Thank you so much for this participation. So now we shall be with why Saudi Arabia purchased Newcastle English Club and how is this considered a sports laundry. This would be the intervention of the member John, the founding member of the No Saudi Tune campaign.
Okay, shukran. First of all, on behalf of Newcastle United football fans against sports washing, just want to say that we're very honoured to be on this platform and humbled to hear the testimonies of the victims of the Saudi regime. Now, so to the background about our campaign, Newcastle is a city of about 290,000 people in the northeast of England. It's the traditional industries were shipbuilding, engineering and mining. It therefore has strong working class traditions of unity and solidarity. The people of Newcastle are called Geordies, and we even have our own distinctive dialect, as you can hear the way I speak. There is one football team in the city, and supporting Newcastle United is part of our cultural heritage. The team, despite not winning anything for over 50 years, has massive support, with 52,000 attending all matches. And the support beyond that is enormous. On October the 7th, 2021, there was a collective outpouring of joy in Newcastle when the Saudi state takeover was announced. This was mainly due to relief to see the former owner go. Unbelievably, the Premier League had declared that the Saudi dictators are fit and proper owners for a football club. This is something I'll talk about later. The Saudi regime had carefully prepared the ground for the takeover for over a year. They have a contract with the US public relations firm Edelman for about $800 to $1 million. And they used that PR firm to get into the press in the northeast of England. The role of the northeast press and media has been lamentable. They have acted like a giant megaphone, cheerleading for the regime. Obviously, money talks. I'll just give a couple of examples, and excuse my pronunciation of Arab names. But before the takeover, when the Saudi Minister of Sport, Prince Abdulaziz bin Turki Al Saud, followed the club's Twitter account back in April 2020, the story was reported by the Newcastle's regional paper, the Evening Chronicle. The sports minister's father, as you all know, is Prince Turki bin Faisal Al Saud, who also served in the Saudi government and was, Director General of the Intelligence Service, a post he held for 23 years, 10 days before the attack on the Twin Towers. We all know the crimes that this person has committed, but the Evening Chronicle didn't think it was worth mentioning any of this information about the sports minister's family, instead preferring to enthuse about the prospects for the takeover. This is before the takeover took place. This season, last season, the final home match of the season, the Chronicle also reported that the club's new director, Majed Al-Sarraj, had publicly asked the ambassador in the UK, the Saudi ambassador, Prince Khalid bin Bandar, for attending the match. He attended a Newcastle match. There was no mention of the association of these figures or their roles in the Saudi dictatorships. This is the type of people now who are able to publicly associate themselves with our club without members of the Northeast media commenting on who they really are. These are clear examples of sports washing. Now, I want to say a word about the role of Northeast politicians since the takeover. I mentioned at the beginning, it's a strong working class area, the Northeast. Most of the representatives in Parliament and the councils are from the Labour Party, and you would expect them to say something about this takeover. Well, to be honest, they've been as bad as the media, and in some cases, even worse. The MP for Newcastle Central had spoken out against human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia in Parliament before the takeover, which was fantastic. But since the takeover, hardly a word has been said. At the time of the takeover, we actually had the spectacle of the Labour leader of Newcastle City Council metaphorically laying out a red carpet for the regime. Obviously, vague promises of investment had been made. But since the takeover, over a year ago, most MPs and councillors have been mostly silent. And the press continue to claim that the PIF, the Public Investment Fund, is not the Saudi state. No one really believes it, but they repeat it. Yet in 1 year, the links between the state and the club, the Saudi state and the club, have got stronger. In January 2022, Eddie Howe, who was the manager of Newcastle United, or the coach, took the team to Jeddah, where they trained and played a match. In the same week, Saudi Arabia launched missile attacks on Yemen, one of which killed 3 children who were playing on a football field. The club is now sponsored by Saudi companies, Noon, Saudia, the air carrier, and the esports brand VOV. The narrative the regime has managed to establish with the help of the media and the silence of politicians is as follows. 4 main points. The first point that they hammer home all the time on social media is that fans are powerless. You've probably heard that before. The people are powerless. We can't do anything. And the Premier League declared the Saudi state fit and proper to own a football club. So it's been done. We have to accept it. 2, that the PIF is separate from the Saudi state. They repeat that again and again. Then the third point, they say, what about Manchester City, owned by Abu Dhabi? What about Chelsea, which was owned by Abramovich? This in Britain we call whataboutery. Well, we are bad, but what about other ones? And the fourth point is, this is something which came from figures like Alan Shearer, who was the famous striker for Newcastle, but also some of the politicians. They said, if we engage with the Saudi state, if we show how good we are in Newcastle, then perhaps we can moderate and liberalize them. Well, everybody knows what's happened in the last year. The day before the Chelsea match last season, which the previous speaker mentioned, 81 people were executed the day before a game. This narrative is reinforced in the media and repeated in the fan magazines, which we call fanzines, although we have managed to get our alternative voice heard. Now, there are Newcastle fans like us who do not accept this narrative. We do not accept these points. So what did we do? Actually, on the day of the takeover, we launched a small group on Facebook of fans who were opposed to the Saudi state owning our club. Also, there was, independently of us, there was fans who launched a Twitter account. You can look it up, no Saudi Tune. You can find all our information on there. And we held online meetings during the pandemic. And in August this year, we held a public meeting in Newcastle where we showed 2 documentaries about the Saudi state's bloody war in Yemen. We launched a fanzine. Again, I mentioned it's a fans magazine. This is called Hailstones in the Desert. It's named in homage to brave Saudi human rights activists. In the UK, you probably know that anyone who stands up for human rights is usually called a snowflake by the right. And we faced that insult on social media. So we turned it around and said, to stand up for human rights in Saudi Arabia, you have to be hard and you have to be brave, and you're like a hailstone. So that's the name of our fanzine. Now, little by little, over the past year, we've managed to get noticed and had our voice heard in the media. Interestingly, first in Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, who all ran articles in the football and in the general press. I think this reflects the international nature of football, that players from Sweden, Germany play in Newcastle, but also the question of human rights, which doesn't stop at the border. Human rights are an international issue. Around the anniversary of the takeover in October, our campaign really started to go onto a higher level. Articles and interviews were carried in the main Northeast newspapers. It was incredible that we were covered in the international press, but we hadn't been mentioned in the local press. But that changed. They couldn't ignore us any longer. And what happened was we appeared on the radio, and also we appeared on the TV. Also, we're becoming now a reference for the question of sports washing when the media wants to talk about sports washing in the Northeast. With the help of ESOHR, we produced a banner and we held a protest outside in Newcastle's stadium before the match against Chelsea. This was to mark the execution of the 81 people who were executed when Newcastle paid Chelsea the previous season. This was a very, very important event. We highlighted the cases of the 8 miners who are facing the death penalty. The protest received good coverage and sparked a wider and wider debate amongst the fans. Before the protest, however, we received physical threats and the attention of the Troll Army directed from the Etidal Global Center for Combating Extremist Ideology in Riyadh. But we said to the press before the protest, the worrying aspect of the ongoing Saudi ownership of the club is that not only have they managed to neutralize the majority of fans, which is unfortunately true, regarding human rights abuses, they've managed to get a minority of fans to actually defend them and speak up for them. And that's why we are obliged to protest. However, we were confident, and as regards our protest, that the majority of fans, despite the threats that we had, would respect our right to protest. And so it proved. Many fans stopped to speak to us and find out about our point of view, which shows the potential for our campaign to win hearts and minds. So where are we now? Where are we going? We have a new edition, the 2nd edition of the fanzine coming out soon, which will feature an article by a Saudi football fan, amongst other articles. And I think the campaign rests on 3 important pillars. First of all, we're going to use the fanzine and future protests to involve more fans in our campaign. When we stood outside the ground, we didn't have a lot of people, but we attracted people. And once other fans saw that we were serious about campaigning, we started to gather people around. Our Twitter account went from a few hundred to a couple of thousand, which I think is a glimpse of the possibilities to build a campaign. The second point is a question of this, what I mentioned at the beginning, the Premier League's owners and directors rule. Another human rights group, ALQST, and Fair Square, 2 other groups, they've written to Northeast MPs urging them to speak out. Now, given the record of the political representatives so far, we don't expect too much at the moment, but that's why it's very important that we build the grassroots fan movement. But what we say is that things can change. Things are not set in stone, that governments can change as well. And the rule of who is fit to own a club could change. And this is going to be one of our campaigning issues, that we will demand that there's a human rights clause in the fit and proper rule. And that has to be that has to be something that we push the MPs to say something on. And I think the third question, the most important question for us, is that we have to, like tonight, as we're doing, we have to find a way that Newcastle fans can listen to the voices of the victims of the Saudi state and enable those voices to be heard by Newcastle fans. Up until recently, the narrative has been controlled by the Saudi dictators who own our club through their sophisticated and well-financed public relations machine. Yesterday, I heard a speaker mention the effect of a letter from a victim to Lewis Hamilton. That had a massive effect. We would like to see similar letters from victims and their families sent to Eddie Howe, the manager of Newcastle, and to the players. Eddie Howe famously claimed that he doesn't have enough knowledge of the situation in Saudi Arabia to comment on the situation regarding human rights. Let's give Eddie and the players the knowledge. Let them hear the voices of the victims as well as the perpetrators of human rights abuses. We've heard enough from the perpetrators. We've heard enough from the dictators. Let's hear from the victims in Newcastle. There's also, I think, a lot of work to be done on the question of women's rights and the question of the oppression of women. Newcastle United recently, well, the last few months, bought a women's team, Newcastle United Women. One of the minority owners, Amanda Staveley, is the public face of the women's team. We pointed out as a campaign the contradiction of having 80% owners of our club who discriminate on a daily basis so viciously against women. We brought up the cases of Salma Al-Shabaab and Nora Al-Qatani. And incredibly, some fans repeated the lies from the Itadal Global Center that these women are terrorists. This is another example of using the ownership of our club to sports wash away their clubs. Some fans say, what's it got to do with us? Well, it's got everything to do with it, because they're using our club to divert attention away from what they're doing to women like Shalma and Nora. Now, Newcastle United, as some of you might know, have spent the last week in Riyadh. They played a game against Al Hilal. The week-long warm weather training camp is clearly a massive propaganda opportunity for the Saudi dictators to divert attention away from their many crimes against the Saudi people. Worryingly, as well, they have used the visit to try and incorporate a layer of fans into actively supporting and speaking up for their owners. That is why the campaign by Newcastle fans against sports washing is so important. We have to stop now. We have to stop the normalization of the regime and counter the idea that we can't do anything to show solidarity to Saudi suffering human rights abuses. Amongst the media and political class and a layer of fans, there is a worshipping of the accomplished fact of the club being owned by a bloody dictatorship. We can't do anything. That's what they say. Yet the more we campaign, the more we find fans who are unhappy with the situation. No Newcastle fan supports what the regime is doing. Very, very small numbers would justify what the Saudi dictators are doing. That's our starting point. The majority are good people, and they're not in favor of human rights abuses. But what they don't know and what they're not sure about is how we can oppose them, what we can do. And I think this is what we have to talk about now. And I think it's our job, all of our job, and with people like yourselves, to show them a way, to show them how to do it. I think it's a big battle for hearts and minds, which is going on in Tyneside at the moment. And although we don't have the multi-million dollar resources of the Saudi state, we know our cause is just, and we think we're going to prevail.
Thank you so much for your efforts and for your solidarity. And probably, as you have concluded, although you don't have the millions of dollars, but you have the voice of truth, which is far more stronger and is clear for whoever who wants to listen, for the fans and followers of Newcastle. Thank you so much on behalf of the prisoners in Saudi Arabia and the detainees. And as you have mentioned, Lewis Hamilton, I am pretty sure that the families will be really glad to hear that persons like you are speaking about their suffering. Thank you so much, John. There is a question, one question. You have mentioned that the media, the international media have covered your actions and movements or campaigns, but not a lot of national media channels have actually covered your campaigns. Do you think that some of these national media means have been purchased by money?
Well, obviously I didn't have time to go into all of the details, but actually outside of Newcastle, we did get a lot of national coverage in major newspapers. And I think it's explained because Newcastle is a bit of a bubble. You know, it's a one-team city, and the fans are desperate for support, for success. And it was hard for us to actually make the step to say, look, we're against this ownership. And I think the interest from the press outside of well, around Europe is because there's actually movements of football fans in other countries against dictatorships and states running football. You know about the Boycott Qatar campaign. You know about the movements in Germany for fan ownership, and it's linked up with that, because one of the questions is, what's the alternative? A lot of fans raise, well, what's your alternative? This, and we point out there's actually only two states who own clubs. That's Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia. So we have a choice. Football fans have a choice. Well, which direction are we going? Are we going to bring football back to its roots? Or are we going to allow more states? What's next? North Korea, Iran? Are they going to be allowed to own clubs? And about a question about the press, I think it's more to do in the Northeast, more to do with the idea that the enthusiasm that the team's doing well. They've spent a lot of money. They've bought players that are doing well on the pitch. And I think that's the reason why the press hasn't been interested. But I would say that that's changed. Now we are contacted almost on a weekly basis to make comments. So we actually at a level now, I think we can take the campaign to a higher level. And also, I think a lot of journalists as well who cover these issues are concerned as well. They think that the Saudi state has actually had it too much its own way in Newcastle, and that they need to be answered.
شكرا جدا.
Thank you so much, John. And now we're going to go to another point. So Saudi Arabia has exploited lobbies to manipulate and whitewash. From Washington, we're going to hear the Mr. Ali Al-Ahmed intervention from the Washington. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for the European Saudi Organization for Human Rights and all the workers in it, and the human rights activists in Saudi Arabia and the volunteers. This kind of events is very important to document, and
those in the West who support us, and it's rare to find people like you, and so I applaud your courage and your candor and your time and sacrifice and sympathy with people. It's a lovely day. I will be speaking Arabic right now. So الحقيقة إن العلاقة السعودية
frankly, so the Saudi-US relations go back 90 years ago. and there is no actual change for the image of Saudi Arabia and the United States. United States play only with the forces spread around the world. So media and academic lobbies actually support the political groups. So the media, the US media, whether TV or newspapers, aren't actually independent institutions. They have their own agendas. They promote for other things and cover up other matters. And this applies to the research centers in Washington, the politicians, because the US regime is based upon interests and not upon the truth and right or wrong. This model is also applies in the UK. I dealt with these two states broadly for more than 20 years. Probably I'm the most one that has a very broad experience in this, especially in the human rights aspect. It's very clear that we have a problem here. First of all, a cultural problem. Even human rights organizations, Western NGOs, activists, not all of them, but a lot of them, even following or covering human rights, they come or originate from their own perspective. They focus on special issues and ignore other. The case of Dr. Fad Al-Qahtani, one of the most important political prisoners in Saudi prisons, because he has founded a political movement inside the country publicly. Probably, as Saudi has said, it's one of its kind. He's very educated, and the martyr Abdul Hamid are among the elite in our country and accepted throughout the country. But most of the West have actually ignored his case, although Dr. Fad Al-Qahtani is the father of 4 American citizens and graduates of the US and is known by them, but they have chose to ignore his case. Even the US media have ignored his case, and it's very clear. Why? Because they don't want to promote such models, and they only want to promote for other models which aren't really out of interest in our country. So if we have compared the case of Dr. Fad Al-Qahtani with Ra'af Al-Badawi, look at the interest of media to Ra'af Al-Badawi compared to Al-Qahtani. Of course, Ra'af Al-Badawi was imprisoned unjustly, but the latter doesn't have the same importance as the one of Dr. Al-Qahtani. So here we see that it's very intentioned cherry picking on how to choose the topics to support broadly or not, as in Qatar now, the very big focus on the LGBT community and ignoring other states or other cases. So the same people who are focusing on such issues in Qatar, and they consider Qatar have done violations in human rights, and of course it had, but they chose to ignore other cases as terrorism or corruption or others. So Saudi Arabia, and because it's an LA for West, and this has reflected in the media coverage and the articles of the authors and the analytics of the research centers. So there are 2 kinds of sites. There are sites or parties who are working for the sake of money. There are research centers. The Middle East Institute is actually funded mostly by Saudi Arabia with millions of dollars, around $20 million also from UAE and Saudi Arabia. That's why you can't find any coverage by them academic-wise. for what is happening in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, or UAE. All they do is falsificating the facts and cover up for the crimes. Even the academic analysis isn't there. So it's very important to focus on this point. Also, on another note, for ideological reasons, there's an organization for Washington Institute for the Middle East. It's a Israeli ally, and it used to criticize Saudi Arabia very carefully, but after Saudi Arabia said it would be open to Israel, its attitude changed 180 degrees, and right now it's promoting for the Saudi regime, and Dr. Matawi have mentioned this. I have a personal experience. The university which I graduated in master's degree, it's a Catholic university and it follows the Catholic Church. The head of the university is a man of religion. And after I graduated, and probably I was the most prominent among the Arab and Muslim students because we were a very small group. After I graduated by several years, I have communicated with the special newspaper for the Faculty of Commerce and Business. They told me, oh, we need graduates from the faculty because we want to show them on the cover of the newspaper, and you are a famous person and we will interview you. And for sure they did interview me. They took a lot of photos in my office in Washington, and this was supposed to I was supposed to show on the cover of this newspaper, B magazine, in the St. Thomas University in the Minnesota state, Minneapolis. But at the last moment, the head of the university, who is a father, he withdrew this interview and prevented them from publishing it in the newspaper, despite I'm one of their graduates. And afterwards, the head of the university wanted to only preserve the Saudi students who were then the Saudi government sending thousands of Saudis there, or a big number there of Saudi students, because they were funding and supporting them by a lot of money. So according to this, he decided to prevent this interview from being published. There are a lot of other examples when media from Washington Post, New York Times, we have information about Thomas Frieden, who is a journalist. A lot of Middle East actually have a bright image about this oath. He was actually paid a lot of money in order to pay an article for the interest of Mohammed bin Salman, whitewashing his image. Not just Saudi Arabia, but other states and countries pay for such articles a lot of money. The CNN reporter, for example, he would do some narrations or stories which would support Saudi Arabia as PR release, as advertising news. This is very common in the media. Most of all, the reason would be financial wise. And all of these media institutions, universities, academic researchers, they are related in a way or another in a geopolicy or for the reason of money, they do this. So one of them, before being, he used to work in the White House, and he was a friend of mine. And he told me back then that the US ambassadors, when they go back to Washington, they seemed more like Saudis because they were either getting promises to conclude agreements after they were released from their posts, or they were promising themselves to gain some money. And right now, this very friend has become a pro-Saudi regime. But in the West, in general, all our work in politics, research centers, money affects their attitudes and approaches. You rarely find research centers who are very transparent and authentic. Last week in Carling Center, it was supposed to be a respectful center. Apparently, it's not. The meeting was about Saudi Arabia and the US-Saudi relations. I communicated with Aaron David Miller, the presenter of the program, and I told him, you are doing this session and you are not Saudi, neither Arab, or you don't know Arabic, and your guest isn't Arab. Probably he knows a little bit of Arabic language, but I know both. And also your other guest isn't Arab and neither Saudi. So why did you do that? So there are a lot of people who can speak in your program. I didn't put myself as a candidate. Even if I was invited, I would refuse. But my point was, as I desire, it's nothing about us without us. We shouldn't allow anyone to speak about our country, about our issues, without being a part of this. This is a campaign I hope to launch in the beginning of next year. The West, what happened in Carnegie is a promotion, and Haikal actually supports bin Salman, and it's a mix of the common ideology and reasons of being funded or supported money-wise. A lot of universities, Washington or other universities, for the sake of money, they are ready to, as John mentioned from the UK, he spoke about Faisal Al Saud. But there are a lot of similar examples. He is one of the members of Georgetown councils and Carnegie and others. And despite that, he is committed a lot of bloody crimes. We have spoke about Nasser Al-Said, who is one of the most prominent Saudi opponents. Who assassinated him was Turki Faisal Al Saud. Unfortunately, before I conclude here, I want to mention that I hope that we don't allow the Western governments, the Western presidents to make them as human rights icons. If you look to Canada, which is supposed to be a liberal country, Justin Trudeau, the prime minister, is considered a liberal person who defends human rights. But this country has always supported Saudi Arabia, supported it with arms also, and until now is doing that. And it has deported a lot of asylum seekers. One of them is right now in the UK, who is Aysam Al-Balushi or Asim Al-Balushi, and other asylum seekers from Saudi Arabia who were deported during the past years. So I'd like to confirm here that these centers and these media always speak about for a specific hidden reason and not necessarily out of truth, honesty, non-biased approach. So it's our responsibility to exercise pressure and sanction everyone who violates human rights. Probably we call here for support, and as Mr. John and as Mr. Stanley have done, we should exercise pressure in order to reach our goal, which is improving the human rights situation and also exercising pressure on everyone who supports such states which are killing and murdering, whether they were the US, UK, or others. Thank you so much, Abu Hassan, for your intervention. And right now we have reached the end of this conference with the recommendations of the European Saudi Organization for Human Rights with dua. Thank you, Mr. Amin. Thank you, everyone. They are not actually recommendations for the European Saudi recommendations, but the conclusions from the speakers, the experts, the activists during these 2 days. These are primary recommendations which shall be modified and amended and shared with other NGOs in order to stand against the attempts of Saudi Arabia to whitewash and manipulate its image. I shall read them to you, and we shall reframe them and rewrite them and share them with all the participants. These recommendations are according to your interventions. Develop the cooperation between the local and the international organization to raise the voice before the UN agencies and with regards to the UN mechanisms. Also work with the Western NGOs and parties in order to stand against the manipulation and whitewashing and place or implement more effective mechanisms. Also, build up a network with the victims of Saudi Arabia and document their cases, monitor all the promises of the Saudi regime, whether from the Crown Prince with regards of human rights, and clarify where they have manipulated. Take more serious steps, especially towards parties or the sides who are investing in Saudi Arabia, and try to give the human rights a priority. And also monitor the cases of violations of human rights in Saudi Arabia, and also work with the academic research centers, universities in this regards, and activate the interaction between the Saudis who live outside to build up a civil community outside. Also seek to reach civil communities in the states which support Saudi Arabia to give them more information on the violations, and also to stop supporting Saudi Arabia in any case, and also stop the sports whitewashing. Thank you again for all the participants in the name of the European Saudi Organization for Human Rights. Thank you so much, Dua. And we would like to thank everyone for your speeches, your interventions, for those who posed questions. Thank you so much. And if anyone has any comment, you would have the platform. So since no one has any comments, we wish you a good evening here and a good weekend. Good night.